One of the most confusing modifications you can do to your car when it comes to suspension is installing air. Now, there's a lot of people out there that I'm already gonna make upset about this because they're gonna say, no, it's all about angle kits and KPI and math and geometry, and I get it, okay? There is very difficult things in the suspension realm, but when it comes down to just a car part modification, just doing something in terms of putting your car on air, it can be very confusing for individuals that may have never gotten into doing this, which is why we're here, which is why we're making this video, because this isn't useless information anymore. This is useful information. In today's 20-minute episode, it's me and you, and we're talking about air suspension, which, by the way, I'm Alex.Martini with 2 underscores on Instagram. If you guys are looking for car parts, you can mod your car over at martiniworks.com. And if you go out there, you go to the top, you're going to see air suspension kits as an option for suspension mods. We're one of the very few people out there that actually sell full air suspension kits with one price, everything included, so that when you actually decide to pick up an air suspension kit, you don't have to piecemeal a bunch of different parts together to make it work. You're just getting it from one spot, makes it very, very easy, and we are the lowest price on the internet. So that's the whole plug for this video, but let's jump into it, because you may be wondering, Alex, what do I even have to know to get an air suspension kit so I don't feel like I'm just learning a different language? So what's included in an air suspension kit? What would you get if you bought something from Martini Works? Let me explain. Air suspension has a few more bits and pieces than something than just like a coilover kit. In an air suspension kit, you're gonna have something that's called the ECU. That's essentially just the brain of the system. That's gonna help make sure that everything that it's supposed to be doing, it's actually doing. And it's also going to help navigate how much pressure needs to be in each of the bags through the use of something called a manifold. The manifold is what I would consider an air train station. If you want to figure out how air is getting through the lines and into the bags, it's through a manifold, which essentially uses some sort of switch system or some sort of electronic system to help cut off the air based on the amount of pressure that's in the bags. Air struts, those are the actual things that are going to go in replacement of your OEM suspension, and a lot of times those air struts are going to have bags that are included and that are mounted inside the air strut. That is what's going to make the car go up and down. As air gets fed through the air lines and how much air is being fed through those air lines via the manifold from the ECU telling it how much, you're essentially going to get the car to go up and go down. To do this right, you can't essentially just blow air like you would into a ginormous inflatable. That's just not going to work. So you need something called a compressor. A compressor is that really loud thing that you hear when you're at a car show and you're wondering why it's taking everybody a couple minutes to leave the car show, because they're letting the compressor kick on and take in all the air, compress it down, and they put it into a tank. That tank is that big shiny bean pill that you'll see sometimes mounted to the top of a trunk, the bottom of the trunk. You'll see 2 of them. Sometimes you'll see 1 of them. Sometimes you'll see 3 of them if they've got a big truck, but essentially it's just an air tank. Those can typically fill up to 200 pounds of pressure that you'll see in those tanks, but a lot of times most people will sit at anywhere from 120 to 160. On top of all of that, the only other thing that you really have to keep in mind is that there's going to be wiring that's involved in this process. It's going to make sure the air does what it needs to do and goes to where it needs to go. And then the accessories, those are just the things that are going to come with the kit to make sure that you can do it all without needing to buy additional things. Some of the first very introductions of what Airlift was, it was essentially just a rubber air spring that was inserted into a car's factory coil spring. And that essentially helped it with weight shifting happening from the front to the back of the car. Where it really started to grow roots was in motorsport. It was in NASCAR. A lot of times what people had found with Airlift Performance was because the suspension was bagging so badly in the back because of just how NASCAR is as a motorsport, if you could find ways to toughen that up to get more traction more consistently, even as you were kind of playing with the throttle, that essentially gave you better lap times. And that's essentially why people started jumping into buying Airlift Performance air suspension coil over spring kits. They had a way different name back then than you do now, but that's how they got really started. Where they really started to see a ton of success though was in drag racing. Essentially some of the earliest days of Airlift Performance, you can see some of their old photos where they used to go to drag strips and they used to promote their springs, their air springs on different dragster cars. Essentially, they'd give them to dragsters for free if they put the sticker on the back 3/4 panel of their car. And they did. That was like old school marketing at its finest, and people loved it. The fact that you could get a additional traction right out of the gate without having to deal with any sort of weight shifting squat, and a whole bunch of scientific math that came around with it meant that you were actually gaining tenths of seconds just by installing the air suspension air spring. That's how they got started. That's how they got popular. Now, as we're kind of talking about the quality of the entire thing, one of the big things that I want to keep in mind is that the cost of air suspension kits is pretty almost identical to the quality of kit you're going to get. And I hate saying that, but there's not a whole lot of suppliers out there right now. Airlift is and used to be the second most expensive brand out there, only second to AccuAir. Now with AccuAir out, there's only going to be more expensive kits on unique fitments like a Ferrari or like a Lamborghini or a McLaren or things like that, where the bag system is developed by like Universal Air, and then it's got a 3P airlift management system to go along with that. But one of the biggest things that matters here is the bag material. Now, I don't know where airlift bags are made, but brands like Continental Tire are iconic for making the bellows that sit around most air suspension struts. The cheaper the air suspension system though, 9 times out of 10, it's because they cheaped out on the bag itself. That is where you're going to see the biggest like cost of somebody like Airlift making the system, is the actual bag and the dampers that are inside of that air strut. So if you want something that's going to give you that performance kind of talk that we've been mentioning in the past, having something that's an air suspension kit that has damper control or has some sort of adjustability on the top, coming with the camber plates, going with those things, those are really good things to keep in mind on if you're buying a air suspension system that can do stuff as well as just look good. 'Cause a lot of people just buy it because it looks good. Totally get it, totally hear you. But if you do want something that can actually perform pretty well, that's why we really do like the Airlift performance stuff, because it does have that adjustability on the top mounts. It does have camber adjustability on applicable kits, and I think that that's really, really important. It goes without saying that just buying struts will not get you an air ride kit. We see this a lot, and we know it's a really common question. We know there's a lot to it. That's why we don't even really sell just the struts on the website, is because sometimes people think, just get the struts and I should be good to go. Unfortunately, that's just not how it works. You need the struts, the lines, you need clamps and fittings, the management system, all to make it work, or otherwise it just doesn't work. If you're on the fence of buying air suspension and you want to break it out, a lot of times people will finance their air suspension kits. They'll go through something like a Firm or Catapult that we have on the website, which breaks it into monthly payments. That does make it a little bit easier because the price of an air suspension kit is like $3,300. Now, we don't want you to go in debt, and so I really think it's important that you get a short-term loan if you are going to do that. But the second thing to keep in mind is if you're saying, I don't want to go and do that, I want to just get the cheapest possible thing I can, you can get struts, you can get a manual switch system, you can control it all on the inside of your car, you can get rid of the actual digital display and just use something like a switchboard to essentially air up your bags. You can get one compressor, you can get a small tank on the internet, and you can piecemeal an air suspension kit together for maybe $1,500 instead of $3,000. But the thing to keep in mind is you lose every element of what makes an air suspension kit versatile as you do that. And instead what you're going to end up with is just a car that can go up and down, but it's not going to feel very good, and it's not going to drive very good, and it's not going to be anything else besides maybe good for pictures, which I would personally not recommend, because if you do like driving your car, your suspension is the number one thing I would recommend that you don't cheap out on, right next to good tires. Now, air suspension, I do kind of consider a little bit of a maintenance item, because you do have to keep it like in the back of your head as you go through like everyday life. There's a couple things I'm going to keep in mind. Water traps. Water traps are something that people will install on their air suspension kit, and it does exactly what it sounds like. It traps the water so that the water from humidity or condensation doesn't actually get into the lines of your air suspension kit. Now, I did not have any water traps on the 430, and by God, do I wish I did, because I'm pretty sure like a pint of water came out as we were replacing those systems with our new airlift system for the car. Water traps are huge because they're going to help maintain the quality of your air suspension kit. The second thing I'm going to keep in mind is that they talk about ripped bags, and they talk about, oh, well, you know, if it rubs through, your whole car is going to be ruined. This is super dangerous. Don't install airbags, blah, 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 blah. It's literally like any other car part. Bags are no different. You want to check those clearances as you get them installed, because if you do blow a bag or if you do tear a bag, you are going to be in a little bit of trouble in terms of how you actually end up getting that fixed. Now, if you check your tolerances and you make sure your wheels aren't rubbing, you have absolutely nothing to worry about. And that's the big thing about this, is that as long as you install it correctly, you have absolutely nothing to worry about. Why people are hesitant about air suspension is, like I said, it's about people thinking that if they're going to track their car, they can't do it on air suspension. And why I think that if you do it right, you shouldn't have anything to worry about. Every shortcoming I've ever had with air suspension has either been because I've tried to shortcome, a deadline, or tried to get something installed super duper quick, or just because I didn't pay attention to what I was doing. It wasn't actually the system's fault or anything like that. It was because of me. Now, what I can say is some of the management systems have gotten overtly difficult for no other reason than because I think the whole industry doesn't really know what's next. Pressure-based systems have been around for a long time, and I don't think they have any intention of going away anytime soon. What's the difference between a 3P known as pressure or 3H known as height sensors? What are those differences? So as you've put air into a bag through the use of your controller in the side of your car or inside your car, you're going to see a number. That's the pounds of pressure that you have in your bag. That is essentially what that is. It's the pounds of air pressure in the bag to determine the height of your vehicle. Now, old AccuAir, before they went out of business, would tell you that pressure does not determine the height of the car. That's why height sensors were invented. And people started to buy 3H, which is a height-based system. So instead of just using the bag to determine the height through pressure, you actually install a little sensor that gets mounted to usually like some sort of stationary component inside your suspension geometry of your wheel well. And that points downward, and that monitors the distance from the ground back up to the sensor. And that is measured in nanoseconds, milliseconds, thousands of times a second pretty much. And then that information is fed back to the ECU to tell it how much air should be in the bag for that corner. So choice is up to you. I would say follow the Michelin rule if you're looking at getting air suspension and you're trying to get onto the track. And what I mean by that is if you are using your vehicle for 30% track, just get pressure. If you're using it for 50% track, I would still go with pressure. The only time where I'd say you'd really want to maybe look at height being an option for you is if you're looking at like greater than 70% usage and you still want to have air suspension. That means your car is being used 70% or more on the track. The final thing I can say, when you go to install, details matter. Cutting your line perfectly straight is huge. Now, Airlift includes a line cutter in their kits, which means if you buy from us, you're gonna get that line cutter. Use that line cutter. Do not use scissors. Do not use box cutters. Do not use any of that. Any sort of angle you give to those lines when you cut it can impact any sort of air leaks that you may have after you're done. Use Teflon tape or plumber's tape for the threads to prevent leakage. Remember that tightening more when you're putting everything together doesn't actually stop leaks. In the end, you'll actually end up breaking more than fixing the leak. If you're looking for a little pro tip on when you install your air suspension, what we can say, use soapy water to see what's going on, and you're probably forgetting the tape, or you just didn't cut straight. 9 times out of 10, those are the 2 most common causes of any sort of air leak that you may have in an air suspension kit. Make sure that when you go into and finalize your air suspension kit, tuck your lines and secure them. Don't let them flop around, because it's only a matter of time if they rub up against a wheel where they may cause an air leak, or they pop and they become an issue. But don't over tighten. So finally, the most expensive thing I've talked about is management. You might be asking why it's important. Management is important because it gives you the eyes on your bag's pressure, which determines your ride height. Now, there are manual versions of this, and there's analog management, all sorts of different kinds. Typically, we recommend the kind that comes with the 3P system. You're going to get a nice little internal controller. You're going to be able to set presets for your ride height based on the bag's pressure. It's going to give you everything you need. You can go with older systems that are a little bit more, I want to say, like analog, but a lot of times, just in terms of how much the technology has progressed, 3P has been in the industry for such a long period of time to the previous version, and we haven't really heard of any future version coming yet, which is why I just think investing in 3P is kind of like buying like a Chevy LS. You're getting a solid foundation. It's not anything too crazy, and it's not anything too archaic, and I think the price is just pretty damn good. Now, When you get your air suspension kit, you're also going to be able to choose your air line. On Martini Works, we try to choose it for you. It's a 1/4 inch line. What we're referring to is the diameter of the line that you would run from the struts to your management system. You can get 3/8. 3/8 is actually on a couple cars that I've done this in the past. It's just a bigger line, and sometimes people will run it for their bigger vehicles. If you have something that's over, I would say 2 tons, I would recommend probably jumping into the 3/8 line. If you have something under 2 tons, 1/4 inch line is going to do just fine. And in my opinion, personally, I even think 3/8 line might be a little bit overkill for a car, period. It just speeds up the time it takes to air up your car. What I have noticed is on a car like mine, 3/8 line will treat it like hydro. It literally will air up so fast. It doesn't have any sort of sex appeal when it airs up. It's like a jump scare when you're looking at it. So I try to be very casual about it when my car shows. Compressor count. You can get your compressors in 1 count or 2. So like I said, 1 compressor or 2 compressors, depending on how big your car is. Typically, I would say 1 is okay, 2 is great. And then getting a 5-gallon tank for most standard size cars is probably expected. 4-gallon tank will do the job as well. 3-gallon tank is really for smaller cars. But when you're looking at that, you're gonna have an option for a 444C compressor or a 400C compressor, essentially taking all the marketing lingo out of it. The higher the number, the more powerful the compressor. Keep in mind, compressors get very hot. They are toasty little bastards, and I have had a mountain of times where I've accidentally touched one as it's been running, and it is not an enjoyable experience. So keep that in mind, especially as you're installing your compressor, that you give it space to have a little bit of air. Don't rub it up against anything. Definitely don't put it against any plastic. A lot of times what you'll see is compressors can actually melt lines, and that can be the cause for a lot of air leaks because people just stuff things above their compressor. Next thing you know, you accidentally melted a line. Finally, I'm gonna give you just a couple lingo items to keep in mind before you pick up your air suspension kit, hopefully from us. And if you have any questions as you're listening to this, just let us know in the comments. We're always here. We're here to help. So, lingo. You might hear of a term called PTC. That's just called push to connect. These are just to get you to plug into an airline. They're very, very nice. You just want to make sure that the actual PTC matches the size of your airline. It can also help with diagnosing issues so that you can quickly just remove it and you're right as rain. NPT. It's not something that I've typically used a whole ton, but some people have. National Pipe Thread Tapered Thread is actually what that stands for, which is kind of repetitive. But you want tapered as these are in the tank, so they help seal. Just remember that since the threads are tapered, the fitting won't actually look flush. So you're gonna see a lot of fittings and stuff that come with your air suspension kit, depending on the size of your line. Make sure you use that plumber's tape. Make sure you tighten it nice. Don't over tighten, but it's actually not gonna sit all the way into the tank. It's gonna kind of sit above it a little bit because it's tapered. Now, you might hear of a term called like a solenoid or a valve. This is the valve that just controls the airflow for your air ride system. Each corner typically has 2 valves, one to dump, one to inflate, and typically those are utilized in something that we would call a manifold. So this is the thing that takes in the air and distributes it. Something like an Airlift 3P, for instance, is gonna have this and the ECU combined. Finally, a check valve. This is just a one-way street valve. They're good to install in between the tank and the manifold because you don't want the air to go backwards. But a lot of times you don't really have to worry about that. The instructions on the Airlift Performance side are gonna tell you everything you would need to know while you're installing this. Instructions are huge on installing air suspension kit. Even though you have a buddy that could do it, still follow the directions. I promise you, doing it their way will always be easier and faster and more efficient and more reliable than having a guy tell you that you don't need to do this, 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 and this. Just trust me. If it's your first time at least, do it the boring way. And then if you do it a second time, do it the boring way again. And when you're under the third car, then you can start taking shortcuts where you think it's the most important. But air suspension technically is a very good aftermarket solution. The Airlift Performance struts have a lot of technology behind them to be performance oriented while still giving you the ability to raise and lower your vehicle, which is why they're a little bit more expensive. The ECU is fantastic. The 3P is awesome. It's a very just simple system to work with as long as you install it right. So if you guys and gals are looking for air suspension kits, let us know. You can head on over to martiniworks.com. We have pretty much every single fitment I think Airlift offers out there, but if there is something that you want for your car that you don't see, you can hit that little message button in the corner and we can certainly get it sorted for you. This is a lot of information, a little less funny than I typically would be, but again, air suspension is a little bit more work and it does require a little bit more knowledge. And if you're willing to have that like expectation, if you're willing to jump up to the task, it can be a really rewarding feeling when you dial in your wheel and tire fitment and then you have the ability to lower your car. It looks fantastic. But if you do it wrong, your car is going to end up on a lift and you're going to have to redo it anyway. So let us know what questions you have. I'm Alex Martini. Thank you so much for watching. If you're looking for car parts, mod your car, martiniworks.com.